Can I kick off here? I'm going to ask Sean O'Donoghue from the Killybegs Fishermen's Organisation to speak first. The Killybegs Fishermen's Organisation were the first Irish fishermen's organisation to get involved in the European Union Fisheries Alliance, which was the coming together of fishermen's organisations in a variety of member states impacted by Brexit to get a common position in relation to Brexit from the European fishing industry. And Sean's been very active in that forum. So, Sean, can I ask you at the outset, in terms of the negotiating guidelines that Michel Barnier has been given on the future relationship and the reference to reciprocal access to water and resources and linking that to the future relationship and the trade agreement, what are your views on that approach?
Thank you, Cecil, for that. Just in terms of your question, I think the transition arrangements and the declaration from the guidelines from the Council on the 23rd of March, they just didn't happen. The amount of work that went into this in terms of, I'd have to say, from an Irish government point of view, both Minister Creed and the officials, and indeed the Foreign Affairs and the government as a whole, have done a tremendous job here. But I think the one thing I want to take from your speech, Minister, is that if we work together, we can achieve something. And I think really the big thing for me, and I've been involved in fisheries for more years than I want to count at this stage. This is the first time on a European stage that I've seen that all of the European fishing industry has the one aim in terms of we want to ensure that Brexit doesn't end up being a disaster for us. And PEM already outlined very clearly what that was in terms of, there's three simple words here. It is all about access, quota shares and the linkage. They're the only three things that matter here, and if we don't get an agreement in terms of the access and quota shares, it actually will have a huge effect, not alone on the Irish fishing industry. I mean, I think this will affect all of the other 8 countries that fish there in the UK waters as well. And I think it is very important that we remain united in relation to this. I think that's the strength of this. The EU 27 were united behind this, and I'd have to say it is extraordinary when you look at those guidelines given to Michel Barnier. The only sector that's actually mentioned in those guidelines is fisheries. And that just didn't happen by chance unless all the homework went in at official level and at the European Fishing Alliance. And I'd have to say the messages, and I've gone to all the countries, doesn't matter, if there's a summit like this in Denmark or the Netherlands, my colleagues are saying exactly the same thing, and I've never seen that happening in European fisheries before. That we all spoke with the one voice. I think the other thing you mentioned, Chair, that you circulated this document. I think that's very useful because we need to separate fact from fiction in relation to this, and I'd have to say the figures coincide with the figures we, as UEFA, have released as well. So they're very close to each other. So at least we do have a set of figures that let's talk fact about this. And from an Irish perspective, our 2 most important stocks are mackerel and nephrops, and we depend on access for 60% on mackerel and 40% on the Dublin Bay prawns or nephrops. And if you economically, they make up about 60 to 70% of the Irish fishing industry in terms of value. So if we lose that access, we have an enormous problem, and it doesn't matter whether you're in Castletown Bay or Dunmore East or Howth or Rossaveel or Killybegs. If Brexit goes wrong, it will be a huge disaster for us. The one final thing I would like to say is that our big concern at this stage is that if there is no agreement, which is a possibility, none of us want to countenance it, but it is a possibility. I am certainly advocating, and I know my European Fishing Alliance colleagues are doing similarly, we will have to have some in that scenario. We just can't fall off the cliff on the 30th of March next year. You will have chaos. You will be back to the Icelandic Cod Wars of the 70s and the 50s. This cannot happen. So common sense needs to prevail on both sides in that scenario. There's going to have to be some arrangement put in place until the withdrawal agreement is agreed. You just can't fall off the cliff.
Okay. Thank you, Sean. Change just the slight direction now to look at the on-land, the role of the processors and the exporters who generate employment on land and add value to the catch. And I'd like to ask Lorcána Cinnéide, as the representative of the Irish Fish Processors and Exporters Association. Lorcána, you have deep contacts in the Irish processing industry, but also in the European processing industry and in the UK processing industries. And I was just wondering if you could give us a perspective on how the processing sector are looking at the current situation and the proposed transition arrangements that have been agreed subject to an overall agreement. How are the processors feeling about the current state of play and how we move forward from here?
Thank you. I don't know, am I mic'd up? Thank you, Cecil. There's a number of aspects to your question. In terms of the European processing sector, which is against the background where the EU, of necessity, has to import a very large proportion of the seafood products that are consumed. There's 123,000 people in Europe who are engaged in the processing and distribution right through the European Union, and this is shared. This view would be shared very directly by the UK seafood processing sector, who have made no secret of it, that the threats to trade, which potential forms of Brexit represent, are extremely material and have the potential to be extremely disruptive. So the view from those who buy the product, processes, distributors through to consumers in Britain, in Europe and in Ireland, is that this could all go very, very badly and be very disruptive over quite a considerable period. Our difficulty is the same difficulty as has been expressed by the Minister and by all the speakers so far. It's just that we're at such an advanced stage in this process, and we are at such a high level of uncertainty that it's already inhibiting investment being made in Ireland, and also investments and the pattern of investment throughout Europe in this sector. And you know, look, we had a situation. It's something akin to the situation that Kildare and Mayo found themselves in this week in Ireland. You know, where we had a threat that one team was going to show up in one stadium and the other team was to show up at the other stadium. Not only is that the case with the current state of play with Brexit, but one of those teams, which is the UK, has not decided what sport it is playing. And you know, and and it's the uncertainty that all causes is quite damaging, and the prospects for you know the the kind of scenarios that are being presented, particularly by the UK catching sector, as to the nirvana that they are going to arrive in once they reclaim their waters, quote unquote, is absolutely ludicrous. They neither have the capacity or the means to actually harvest this product in what they will call their waters, and they certainly seem to be assuming that there will be no barriers to the market. On the other hand, in an Irish context, we are faced with the uncertainties of fresh product from Castletown Bear or from Killybegs, which has to transit through the UK. If it does, is it going to be subject to an additional time and obviously bureaucratic constraint, which is going to be critical in terms of a perishable product, which really demands the shortest possible supply chains. The second thing is that we have a potential here for multiple border crossings. For example, both in terms of imports and exports, but if you would take the export side of it, from, for example, fish that would originate in the port of Killybegs, for example, needing or logically transiting through the north, and what will that represent? We have repeated aspirations and guarantees being given and statements being made that there will be no hard border, but no means of delivering that mechanism exists at present. So that represents, and there seems to be a growing kind of point of view being put forward that from the UK that they don't intend to put in a border, but that somehow Ireland or the EU will be insisting on a border, which is contrary to all forms of logic. But you could have a situation where, we have a lot of product being shipped through the north, across the Irish Sea, through the UK, and onwards through the main distribution channels, say the Netherlands. And the potential for multiple entry and exit regimes, and the uncertainty that represents is, to my mind, proving very, very destabilizing as it currently stands. And I fear that there hasn't been the attention to the detail of the implications of this. Some voices in the UK, particularly on the food and drink industry side of it, who have a very clear view that this represents a real step backwards in their own national interests. Probably, and I think the Minister alluded to this in a recent speech in London, need to make their voices a lot clearer in terms of the discussion, but we're going nowhere unless everybody arrives at the same venue, playing the same game. And that's the problem we have.
Right, thank you, Lorcan. On the catching side, coming back to the catching side, we're affected in relation to many of the species that we fish are shared with the UK and will be impacted either in terms of access or quota share if we have a hard Brexit scenario. But two of the larger stocks we face are mackerel and the prawn fishery, the nephrops fishery. Mackerel are a migratory stock, there are particular challenges there, but in relation to the prawn stock, it's a sedentary stock. The beds are where they are, and at the moment about 40% of our catches are in the UK zone. Francis, you represent the producer organisation that is the largest representative of the prawn fleet. Could you just give us a perspective on how your members are seeing the current negotiations, the transition arrangements that have been put in place, and the approach to the guidelines on the future relationship? How are the prawn fleet, what's their perspective on this?
I suppose the perspective, am I mic'd up? Can you hear me? Oh yeah. The perspective, I suppose, of the prawn fleet at the moment, they are very, very concerned. Up to now, I think they've been quite happy with how this has been dealt with politically. I think the European Alliance was a fantastic development, and to be fair, Sean O'Donoghue, my colleague here on the left, was very instrumental in getting that up and running and getting people working together. I suppose at the outset, there was this idea that, well, the UK are potentially going to leave the EU. They're going to take back their waters. maybe we should consider doing the same thing. Well, that's not going to happen. Ireland is going to remain in the EU, so it was always about safety in numbers. So I think the initial alliance was a very good development for the prawn fleet, because they're looking at fishing 30-40% of their quota in UK waters. And if they were denied that, say, in a cliff edge scenario, I mean, a lot of those businesses, vessels initially, which employ 6 or 7 people, but then you have the onshore side. A vessel is probably employing 20, 25 people. So they were viewing that as well. If this happens to us and overnight we can't fish in UK waters, our businesses are ruined straight away. So we've moved into the transition phase, and certainly that has given us a little bit of comfort. But I think recent developments in terms of, and I think both Eust and Pim referred to it, the fisheries bill, which George Eustace is bringing forward now at the end of the year. And while he is sort of talking in mixed messages, he's clearly saying to the UK fishing industry, we will set our own quotas. This bill will allow us to do that. It will put us on a legal platform to do that. It will also give us the potential to manage access to our waters. And obviously for the prawn fleet, that's a really big issue for us. And what we're afraid of now, I suppose, and I think more so in the last number of weeks, is that, to some degree, politically, the UK could become hostages to fortune here, because bringing forward a bill during the transition phase potentially could tie them up in knots. They may have to deliver. There's going to be a large expectation from the UK industry. Once a bill is in place, once the heads of a bill are there, once it's there sort of in some sort of text form, that's delivered. So it would be devastating for us if we don't have some sort of an arrangement after this initial transition period, or a final deal. In terms of prawns, I'd say it's going to be the hardest hit industry in the catching side, of all. Yeah.
Thank you, Francis. In the current common fisheries policy, one of the major reforms was to create a much stronger structure for inputting industry views into decision making. And advisory councils of industry were created, whereby industry representatives, such as the colleagues who are on the panel here, can participate with their other EU industry colleagues in inputting the industry view into the decision-making processes in Brussels and at national capitals. And these advisory councils have been working well. Patrick, you've worked intensively on the Northwestern Waters Advisory Council. How do you see the Advisory Council and the industry input working post-Brexit? And what way will we be able to get joint industry views, including UK industry views, post-Brexit on stocks that we share?
To put that in context, I think Mr. Pim Visser put it in context. The organisations that are there in Europe at the moment will all change. Will the European, the UK YAPO members stay within the groups? Will they, as a coastal state, be allowed to join these groups within Europe? Will the groups be changed to allow these groups to participate? Will they be in an advisory capacity, or will they be a participant in the groups? So the Northwest Waters members will change after England becomes a coastal state. So unless that's catered for, all these institutions will have to change and adapt with the repercussions of what Brexit will mean.
On the underlying reality, though, that we share the stocks and share the management of the stocks doesn't change. So we still have to find ways of getting inputs.
Look, I think the common thread of this conference so far is the uncertainty of what lies ahead. Until the UK actually set out what they're looking for, it's very hard to act and respond to that. If they increase their share, as Sean has said, somebody else has to pay for this. Somebody else will have to lose out. Under ICE's advice and all the stocks, we cannot exceed what ICES sets on those stocks for the sustainability and the safeguarding of the future of the fishing industry, not for just the UK, but for every member of the EU. We in the South and West have pointed out that Ireland is the nursery ground and the juvenile ground for Europe. A lot of the stocks come here to spawn here, so they're generated here, and they move back into UK waters. If the worst happens, and the UK continue with their threats and the uncertainty that Lorcan has pointed out in the industry over there, the access to fish, the amount of vessels that will be fishing there, who will be allowed to fish there. Will those vessels leave those waters if the UK don't allow them in? As a coastal state, they will take back full autonomy over their waters. So they'll be calling the shots in those regards, unless, as Sean has pointed out, and the Minister, and the hard work that they're actually doing in this, to try and secure an agreement beyond the transition period. That's written in there. If that happens, and hopefully it will happen, then there's certainty brought back into the industry, not just for the Irish vessels, but the European vessels, and of course the UK vessels themselves. I think reality is dawning on everybody here, that this is no good for anybody. The uncertainty that this brings into the industry will affect every fisherman in Europe, not just the Irish fishermen, the European fishermen, the 8 member states, but also the UK fishermen.
One of the features that has been striking since the UK referendum and the debate started on fisheries and Brexit has been the development of a stronger and stronger united view in the Irish fishing industry and in the European fishing industry on what's important in Brexit and how to approach it. Hugo, from dealing with your members and dealing with other organisations, do you believe that that unity will strengthen and will hold as we get into the intensive phase of the Brexit discussion that's coming up? Or is there some danger of fracturing the unity that exists at the moment?
No. Look, absolutely not. We supported this, Sean and the setting up of UEFA, yeah, okay, PEM, yeah, right. UEFA from the very beginning, probably the first that were on board here, along with Sean, not contributing so much money as Sean was, of course, but at the same time, certainly were. I think the organisations, all the organisations as a whole, have seen the benefit that actually brought to the table, especially in a European context. I can't see that actually fragmenting as long as we're looking as far as Brexit is concerned. That's very, very important. It's also very, very important that it doesn't actually fragment. We're not going to, there's still a long way to go with Brexit, just like everyone else. We have our concerns, all the industries have their own concerns, but on this particular front, we were united on it, that we actually will maintain the access, we tie the negotiations to trade in general, and that we maintain our quota. Also, I mean, there are a few things happening and a few things not happening. Obviously, what's not happening is we don't know what is coming out from the other side, really, as far as Brexit is concerned. We don't have anything there. But what the industry, and I'm sure all the industry would like to see, is that I suppose we'd like to hasten the negotiations in some respects. Now, there's obviously going to be a balance here. We're not going to hasten the negotiations and end up in getting a bad deal, obviously. We don't want that to happen. But, we have a great team in place at the moment, led by Michel Barnier. They understand the whole situation as far as the industry is concerned, but the longer it drags on, the more the likelihood of administrations changing and focus possibly changing, and there are a myriad of other concerns throughout Europe, and if admins change along the way, maybe fishing might get lost in that myriad. I would be afraid, and I'm sure my industry colleagues would be afraid that would happen. Obviously, we don't have a target. There's no target there because we don't have a UK position as such, a fixed position. Now, Jules did allude to the fact there that we could still fall off this cliff edge next March, because while there is a transition period proposed and they're working on it, I think he had it up there on the screen that this transition period there was no legal, it wasn't set in law, it wasn't written down in any legal text. So, things can happen, in short periods of time and possibly long periods of time. We would like to see the negotiations continuing, being expedited, let's put it that way, without losing anything in in the rush that we're in, while we have the team that we have in place at the moment.
Okay. I think now it's maybe time to allow the people to pose the questions that you wish to pose. We have some roving microphones, so I just ask you to identify yourself when you're posing the question so that everybody knows who's asking. Sorry, Leah.
Gurma, Leonie Ria, the MEP for Ireland South. Tá sé go húnta go cógáil mar seo ar siúil ar gédal síos agus chuirm fáilte mór ribis an só go háthe an gáileh. I think it's great to hear that you're all actually agreed on the one thing, which is the uncertainty. I'm quite concerned from a European perspective, even in the Fisheries Committee, we had a discussion about the white paper the other day that was leaked, and obviously everybody realised there's no legal basis for it. But what it did bring up, I think, is the lack of preparation, I think, that's going on, maybe from the fishery side of it in the committee, because we like to believe that there are things going on behind the scenes. But I would be deeply concerned, as indeed I'm sure all of you are, in the event of a no deal, which is seeming to become more and more worrying, because what happens if there is a no deal? Does it mean, and what are the practicalities of that? Do we revert back to World Trade Organization rules? Does the CFP, how is that going to implicate, and what impact does that have if we do even have reciprocal access? Does it mean you have to stick to the CFP rules if you're fishing in the UK waters? And how is it going to impact even just on the general sense of all the things that are coming down the tracks in relation to the CFP? I think it's going to be an absolute nightmare to try and deal with all of that. I think relative stability is something that should be looked at down the road when we're looking at perhaps reforming the CFP, depending on what the UK's position is going to be. And obviously North-South access as well, and the neighbourhood agreement, the voisinage agreement. How is that affecting fishermen? I think I'd like to hear from the lads up here, how is that affecting you on the ground? Because I think we are in crisis, and I think we can't be saying, look, we'll just see as we go along, we'll manage somehow. I think plans have to be put in place now, and I'm glad to see that, obviously the Fishing Alliance is a good thing. I just hope that in any dealings and negotiations that are going on, that there's fairness and equality right across the board, because the smaller scale fleets, I think the smaller boats are really, really struggling. That's what I'm hearing from the ground. So I welcome to hear your views on that.
Okay. Who wants to take? Francis, then Sean.
Yeah, I can take a few aspects of what you asked me there, Leah. Because you're what to go by there. Yeah, you're at your Hanik to the degree. Yeah, in terms of the CFP, I mean, it's very, very difficult to know what will happen after, if we have a cliff edge situation and the UK are out. I mean, I would presume they're going to have fisheries management rules, and the indication that we're getting from the UK industry is that regardless of what happens, it's not just going to be, we're going to do what we want. I mean, the CFP, okay, quota share is one aspect of it, but it's a big part of it, of course, but there's all to do with TCMs, what gear you use where, what gear you use in different fisheries. It's a very, very complex, I suppose, fisheries management tool that has developed, I suppose, since 1983. And I couldn't imagine that if the light is switched off in the morning, that the UK are just going to, well, what do we do? They're going to, I would believe, even to have some transition period themselves, they would have to continue with that in terms of the CFP. You talked about the voisinage agreement. Of course, that agreement isn't in place at the moment. There is sort of no bilateral in terms of fishermen in Northern Ireland fishing in our waters and ourselves fishing in their waters. I suppose it's well known that industry, there was a bill brought forward last year. We had difficulties with that fisheries bill. We pointed those difficulties out. But I think, like, in reality, in the long term, and I'd be the first to say it, I mean, fishermen in Northern Ireland, they live on the same islands as us. They are neighbours, and I think that there will have to be an agreement worked out. It was called a voisinage agreement, whatever it's called into the future. And I think that we have to be practical and pragmatic. And I suppose I was one of the voices up to now that was saying, well, I think that we should wait until we see what happens in terms of getting an overall deal, and that possibly we shouldn't rush to put an agreement in place until we know where we are. But I do believe that an agreement will be necessary, yes.
Sean?
Yeah,
Thanks,
maybe,
Ross.
Lee, if I can address some of your points. I think you're absolutely correct about the cliff edge in the things. I mean, that is our biggest concern now, that if there's no agreement on the withdrawal agreement, what happens fisheries? And I'm only here representing the fisheries side of things. Our view is that there needs to be common sense needs to prevail in relation to that, because everything you mentioned, if there's no withdrawal agreement on the 30th of March next year, no European vessel will have access to UK waters. Vice versa, the UK vessels will not have access to EU waters as such. So that is a recipe. Do we really think that the fishing industry in Europe is going to accept that? It's not going to happen. So the common sense needs to prevail here on both sides, that if there is a stalling in terms of the withdrawal agreement, when it comes to fisheries, there needs to be a system in place that the status quo applies until we have a withdrawal agreement sorted out. I mean, these are adults on both sides. We need to be aware that this is the situation. You mentioned the voisinage agreement, which is a very it is part of the London Convention, the '64 London Convention, and the UK will automatically. They've already put in to withdraw from that convention by July of next year. Their 2 years period is up. So if there is no withdrawal agreement, as I see it, the access that the EU member states have between the 6 and the 12-mile zone in the UK zone won't exist if there's no withdrawal agreement. If there is a withdrawal agreement and the transition, that won't come into play. But the real concern for us is this idea, and it is becoming more prevalent in the last, and maybe it's shadow boxing, to be perfectly honest, because I think we can't countenance not having a withdrawal agreement. I mean, it is a disaster. It isn't just a disaster for us, it is a disaster for all the sectors. But we are first in the firing line, so we need to make sure that this doesn't happen. We've been quite successful to date on both the transition arrangements and on the mandate for Michel Barnier from a fishing point of view. And the final thing I would say is that UEFA is not about big or small vessels. We're all the one in relation to this. Whether you're small or big, the access and the quota shares are equally as important to us, to you, whether you're small or big. And we have a united front. We're representing everybody in relation to this. And I haven't seen this happening in European fisheries in my lifetime. And I am only about 38 years involved in fisheries, so I can say with some certainty that I haven't seen this happening. But I think your key point is that, and I can't overemphasize it, and I want to get I know the Minister is aware of this, we can't, from a fisheries point of view, not having a withdrawal agreement is an unmitigated disaster.
Okay, can I take another question from the floor, please? It's Owen. Sorry. There's a microphone coming around. Identify yourself, please.
Owen Fannon's my name. I'm a lawyer working in this area for a long number of years. If I were to say one word has come out of this discussion this morning, the word if. If. The long-term relationship with the UK and the EU is contingent upon a withdrawal agreement. That is contingent upon a transition agreement. And all that is to be done by October this year. Now, I have some experience in international treaties. If that happens, this will be the quickest international treaties that's ever been negotiated in the world, in my experience. Now, it seems to me there is a coincidence of interest between the fishing sectors in the UK, in Europe, and particularly Ireland. We need access to their waters. They need access to the European market. However, in my contacts in the UK with colleagues in the UK and some in the industry, there's this view abroad that this imbalance of catching that goes on in UK waters by EU vessels, that slack is going to be taken up by UK vessels. Now, Lorcan's pointed out they don't have the capacity, but I can tell you there's a view abroad in the United Kingdom, at least in the political circles, and I believe in some of the catching sector, not necessarily the processing sector, but the catching sector, that they are going to be allowed now to catch all that fish. And DJ Mara have said here this morning that the CFP will not apply after whatever happens on 29th of March, with or without agreements. Now, like it or lump it, but the bedrock of the CFP is relative stability. And it's inconceivable to me in the first instance that on 29th of March the lights will go out. But equally, it is inconceivable to me that the UK would simply have autonomy to build their capacity, build as many vessels as they want, whereas European Union vessels still have to comply with the old relative stability situation. So we talk about equal access, and people talk about equal access, and the impression is given that all it will be is I'll drive up my boat into UK waters, I'll throw down my net as I did yesterday, and the other thing will happen. The opposite will happen from the UK side. But unless the CFP, no matter what you want to call it, for getting the UK outside, call it something else, but if European Union vessels are caught, and they will be caught with all the regulations, and I'm talking about the stability again, because the relative stability was brought in, if you look at the historical source of it, for a purpose to make sure there was a kind of a level playing field insofar as it could be worked out with fishing across Europe. Now, if the UK is going to be told, the industry is going to be told, between now and October, by the way, this Nirvana, as Rocket I think talked about it as well, is not going to happen because we have to agree with the European Union. Stability, relative stability has to stand there. So I am very concerned, and anybody looking at the UK at the moment would say, look, confusion is the least of it that's going on there. 29th of March is X number of months away, and I think it may be instructive, and I don't wish to overstate this, that it was this time last year, at the summit last year, that the United Kingdom government announced its withdrawal from the London Fisheries Convention. At least if the convention was in place, there would have been something there that would carry on after the 29th of March. And I'm very concerned, and maybe DJ Mara would like to come back and talk about that, because the way I look at it, these three steps are in sequence. I know the negotiations are parallel, but one has to happen before the second one happens and before the final one happens. And right now, this few short months from the 29th of March, 19, I can understand the industry's concern. And it's the food, it's not just the industry, it's the food, it's the protein source for the people of Europe. And we have to have some way of working out how that is going to be managed. And I mean, managed in the overall, not a simple thing of access, and not a simple thing of quotas, we allow you catch 20 tons, you catch our 10 tons, and so on. It is quite complex. And I cannot see, in my experience of international treaties, how that is going to be sorted in these few short months.
Thank you, Owen. You're right. The access issue isn't only about access to waters. In the European negotiating guidelines, it's access to waters and access to resources, which implies relative stability. Lorcan, you got name-checked there by Owen. Do you want to respond?
Sorry, I can't hear you.
You got name-checked there by Owen in his presentation.
Well, there were a lot of ifs in Owen's question as well. And look, what you've described is the conundrum that we are facing here. There are major realities. It is highly, highly complex. The people I work for in terms of the processing are entirely dependent on the supply, and in Ireland this would be to a much higher extent, very tied in with the interests of the catching sector. If we have migratory species, which, as Patrick said, spawn down off the southwest coast, which happen to transit through UK waters and onwards up to Norway, and that the UK suddenly decides that this is ours. Apart at all from the question of the sedentary, the nephrops issues. But what we have here is a very, one would normally assume a degree of rationality about something this serious. And one would expect it from an advanced and civilized country like the UK. Unfortunately, due to the internal political problems that I see, very substantial interest groups in the UK, which have a very clear understanding of the complexity of the impacts of all this, don't have a voice. They haven't found it. And, you know, it's kind of ironic. We're here the day of the European Council summit, which was, you know, touted as being the day for the Brexit thing for the last, year. That today was the day. We were all getting our socks down around the ankles, and that we were going to get a clearer view. It is by dint of, and it's not for want. I'd have had a lot of confidence in the European Commission's approach, in Michel Barnier's approach. I had correspondence from last week, and in terms of our own government's approach here, in terms of influencing all that. There's been they don't often get praise. People in the Marine Institute and BIM, in the department and the ministers, and at the very highest level, as was referred to earlier. But what we're talking, and I see this kind of potential for irrationality and the lack of facing up to facts as being in itself very, very risky. I'll paint a scenario like this. My summary in general of Brexit is that Brexit is a kind of a disaster for the UK, not regardless of us. I worry about the fact that in that context, that I cannot see how they, logically can expect to have improved trade deals with India over and above what the EU has. It just flies in the face of all logic. I worry, however, that in that context, that there's a kind of a totemic or emblematic attachment and significance being placed on the reclamation of their waters. And as you know, Owen, they're not their waters, they're not sovereign waters. They have a different status under UNCLOS than their territorial waters. They have major obligations in terms of the joint management, in terms of the pre-existing arrangements, all of which are catered for in the UNCLOS treaties. But the difficulty is, in the final analysis, what the UK is leaving is not what they joined. There are, as Michel Barnier pointed out, 750 underlying agreements. They're all as complex as you describe. But there is an incapacity to actually come out front on the range of issues. And I think, whether it's by accident, but whether the tactic is to bore us all to death and achieve Brexit by that means. But certainly it's intensely frustrating for all my colleagues and all of us dealing with this thing. But if the two parties, one party is warring with itself, and the other party has been doing all these contingency plannings and scenario plannings and the devil knows what. I think our side of it, I'm not saying our side of it is right or wrong, but it's better prepared. And it is at least acknowledging this complexity. And I've never seen a situation whereby two parties to a negotiation to put it at its most politely, at such varying degrees of preparedness to deal.
Thank you, Lorcan. Minister?
Thanks very much, Cecil. Just a comment on briefly on the two questions both raised was an out, and just to say that for many good reasons, not least because even in the court judgment it said clearly that that arrangement, which was underpinned by an exchange of letters between Terence O'Neill at the time and Sean Lamass, needed to be underpinned by legislation. But for other reasons, because they're our neighbours, and not least because many of those adversely affected by the judgment are in fact residents of the Republic who are choosing to register in Northern Ireland are now the victims of that court ruling, as well as the fact that we currently still enjoy the right to go to the inshore section in Northern Ireland to fish, whereas, in fact, because of that court decision, those registered in the north don't have that right to come south. I think in principle it's a good thing, it's a right thing to have that neighbourhood agreement. The resolution to it requires legislation, and I would say to Leah, we would welcome support from all political quarters in an effort to pass the legislation that would enable us to do that. But undoubtedly, the mood music has been somewhat contaminated by the decision announced by Michael Gove that they were about to depart the London Convention, which is the treaty which underpins the arrangement. So certainly we remain committed to the principle of dealing with that issue and have indeed published the legislation and would welcome support for it. On the issue of no-deal Brexit, I mean, I remain convinced because of logic that shouldn't happen. I mean, a no-deal Brexit is bad for the European Union, it's very bad for us, but by any analysis, it's a disaster also for the United Kingdom. In fact, in more ways that I could think of than it is bad for us. But I think it would be hugely counterproductive now to open up a debate on relative stability or indeed on a future common fisheries policy, because we have built an alliance with our colleagues across Europe. And what we would effectively be saying by opening up relative stability now is that whilst we value that arrangement, we would equally like to pick your pocket and take some of your share. And I think that would be hugely counterproductive. We've invested, and as has the industry, an enormous amount of effort in building that alliance. I mean, even this weekend, I will be meeting with the French Minister for Fisheries in Cork, discussing these very issues. That group of 8 member states, of which we're one, France, Spain, Belgium, Denmark, the Dutch, the Swedes, the Germans, ourselves, have invested huge energy and effort creating a common platform, feeding into the Barnier negotiating team, and making sure that our position, which is ad idem with what the industry is saying, is clearly understood. And to, at the same time, think that it is productive to open up a debate about relative stability would be really, really counterproductive. And I think that's something that we should bear in mind in the context of that. The other point, Owen, is that transition is contingent on the withdrawal agreement. And I don't want to go into backstops or protocols or no hard border, but that's a commitment that we will not resile one iota from.
Okay. Thank you, Minister. Joost, you want?
Yeah, I'd like to. Yeah, thank you. I'd like to echo a bit the words of the Minister. We are now talking fisheries, and it's true. There are a lot of ifs and there are a lot of uncertainties produced by this situation. But common sense says that there has to be an agreement because the UK needs it much more than we do. Not in fisheries, but overall, a hard Brexit is much more damaging for the UK than for us. So the fact that we are analyzing whether they are prepared or not, in the end, their interest in an overall agreement, a decent, orderly withdrawal agreement, is much more than ours. And that doesn't take away anything of the fears that we have in terms of fisheries, because there we are a bit in an anomaly. And yes, I would also like to confirm that if there is a hard Brexit, situations may be very dramatic. They will become a coastal state with no obligation to EU law any longer, with no obligation on allowing access in principle. But again, I think it was said also, the reality, common sense tells us that in a normal situation we will not end up there, because it will create situations that we don't want to think about. And again, in the bigger picture, the UK has a huge interest in getting to an agreement in a timely fashion.
Okay. Thank you, Joost. I get the feeling that this conversation could go on for a long time, but we've used up the time available to us. So what we're going to do is thank everybody for their inputs, thank the panel for their inputs, thank our visitors who came and gave their time, very thought-provoking presentations. But the Brexit discussion continues after the coffee break. We will discuss the challenges of Brexit for the seafood sector in more detail from different dimensions, and also the question of investing in the seafood route to market in the context of Brexit. So you get another opportunity to continue this conversation. For now, it's coffee break, and thanks to everybody.